There are moments when truth becomes a weapon sharper than any blade, and honor demands a price that no reasonable person would pay. For Leora Ashen, that moment arrived beneath a blood-red moon, in a sacred grove where ancient oaks bore witness to ceremonies older than memory itself. She had not planned to destroy her life that night, had not awakened that morning knowing she would commit an act so unthinkable that even speaking of it would make grown wolves tremble. The ceremonial gown hanging in her chambers had been chosen to complement her sister's bridal attire, soft blues to highlight Kira's ivory silk, a supporting role in someone else's perfect story. But perfection, Leora had learned, was often built on foundations of lies. Now she stood at the edge of the sacred circle, watching her 19-year-old sister sway like a flower in a storm wind, pupils dilated with something that had nothing to do with bridal nerves. The sweet scent of medicinal herbs clung to Kira's skin, a chemical lullaby designed to ensure compliance, and everything inside Leora screamed against the wrongness of it all. Before them, Alpha King Rurik Blackmore waited at the altar like a figure carved from marble and shadow. Beautiful, terrible, and absolutely untouchable. 3 previous wives had learned exactly how untouchable. Their graves stood as silent testimony in the Pack Cemetery, their deaths as mysterious as they were convenient. Leora's hands trembled as she pressed them against her sides, feeling the weight of 7 centuries of tradition, of pack law, of a social order that had never been questioned, because questioning it meant exile or death. Her mother's warning whispers echoed in her mind. Say nothing. Do nothing. Survive. But survival had never been enough for Leora Ashen, and as she watched her sister struggle to form words of consent through a drug-induced haze, she realized that some prices were worth paying. Some lines were worth crossing, and some truths were worth dying for. The moon hung like a crimson eye above the grove, bearing witness to what was about to unfold. In moments, everything would change. In moments, a single act of desperate love would rewrite the fate of an entire kingdom. In moments, Leora would discover that sometimes the only way to save someone you love is to damn yourself completely. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The sacred grove fell into a silence so profound that even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ancient oaks towered overhead, their twisted branches forming a natural cathedral where the most important ceremonies of the Shadowmere Pack had been conducted for 7 centuries. Tonight, under the blood-red glow of the harvest moon, Alpha King Rurik Blackmore stood at the ceremonial altar, his imposing figure draped in the traditional black and silver robes of leadership. At 28, Rurik commanded respect through sheer presence alone. His coal-black hair was pulled back severely, revealing the sharp angles of his face and the network of ritual scars that marked his rise to power. Golden eyes, cold as winter frost, surveyed the gathered pack with the detached calculation of a predator who had never known defeat. The crown of twisted silver and obsidian sat heavily on his brow, a reminder to all that he was not merely an alpha. He was the Alpha King, ruler of the 13 territories that comprised the Northern Dominion. Bring forth the bride. His voice carried across the clearing, each word weighted with the authority of absolute command. Leora Ashen stood at the edge of the crowd, her stomach churning with a mixture of dread and fury as she watched her younger sister emerge from the ceremonial tent. Kira moved with the practiced grace of someone who had been trained for this moment since childhood. Her auburn hair braided with silver threads and wildflowers, her dress a cascade of ivory silk that seemed to glow in the moonlight. At 19, she was everything their mother had groomed her to be: beautiful, compliant, and utterly terrified. She looks like a lamb being led to slaughter, Leora muttered under her breath, earning sharp glances from the pack members around her. Her mother, Lady Mira Ashen, materialized at her elbow with the silent efficiency that had made her one of the most feared political operatives in the pack. "Silence," she hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into Leora's arm. "One word from you tonight, and I will ensure you spend the rest of your miserable existence scrubbing floors in the servants' quarters." Leora jerked her arm free, her hazel eyes flashing with defiance. At 24, she had long since stopped caring about her mother's threats. Someone has to speak for her. Look at her mother. She can barely stand. And it was true. As Kira approached the altar, her steps grew increasingly unsteady, and the sweet scent of medicinal herbs that clung to her skin told Leora everything she needed to know. Her sister had been drugged, not enough to incapacitate her, but enough to ensure compliance. "The girl is nervous, as any proper bride should be," Lady Mira replied smoothly, though her eyes never left the ceremonial proceedings. "This union will elevate our family beyond anything we could have dreamed. Kira will be the Alpha King's fourth wife, and when she bears his heir—" "If she survives long enough to bear anything," Leora interrupted, her voice carrying just far enough to reach several nearby pack members. "What happened to his other 3 wives, Mother? Do you ever wonder about that?" The question hung in the air like a poisoned blade. It was not openly discussed, but every member of Shadowmere Pack knew the truth. Alpha King Rurik's previous mates had all died under mysterious circumstances. The first had supposedly fallen from a tower window. The second had succumbed to a sudden illness. The third had simply vanished one winter night, leaving behind only bloody sheets and unanswered questions. "Accidents," Lady Mira whispered harshly. "Tragic accidents that have nothing to do with our situation. Convenient accidents," Leora corrected, her voice growing louder despite the dangerous territory they were treading. "And now you're offering Kira up like some kind of sacrificial—" "Enough." The single word cracked through the grove like a whip, and every head turned toward the altar, where Alpha King Rurik stood with his hand raised. His golden eyes had found Leora in the crowd, and the weight of his attention felt like ice water in her veins. Is there some dispute regarding this union that requires public airing? The traditional challenge. In the old ways, any pack member could voice objections to a mating ceremony, but doing so carried consequences that few were prepared to face. The silence stretched taut, as every eye in the grove focused on Leora, waiting to see if she would dare to invoke a rite that hadn't been used in over 50 years. Lady Mira's grip on her daughter's arm tightened to the point of drawing blood. "Nothing, Your Majesty. My daughter speaks out of turn." But Leora was no longer listening to her mother. Her attention was fixed on Kira, who had reached the altar and now stood swaying slightly as she faced the Alpha King. Up close, the effects of whatever drugs had been administered were even more apparent. Kira's pupils were dilated, her breathing shallow, and when she tried to speak the ritual words of consent, her voice came out as barely a whisper. I give my consent to this union," Kira managed, though the words sounded rehearsed, hollow. "Louder," Alpha King Rurik commanded, his tone sharp with impatience. "The pack must hear your willing acceptance." Kira tried again, but her voice cracked, and she stumbled slightly. The Alpha King's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something dangerous flickered in his golden eyes. That was when Leora moved. She pushed through the crowd with single-minded determination, ignoring her mother's whispered threats and the gasps of shock from the assembled pack. The ceremonial guards moved to intercept her, but she was faster, her years of training in the pack's warrior division serving her well as she dodged their grasping hands. "Stop!" she called out, her voice ringing clear across the grove. "I invoke the right of challenge." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Pack members began shouting, some in outrage, others in excitement at the unprecedented drama unfolding before them. The guards closed in on Leora, but Alpha King Rurik raised his hand again, and they froze in place. "You invoke a right that has not been used in my lifetime," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Do you understand the consequences of such an action, Leora Ashen?" The fact that he knew her name sent a chill down her spine, but she forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "I understand them perfectly, Your Majesty, and I invoke the right nonetheless." "On what grounds?" His question was soft, almost conversational, but everyone present could sense the coiled violence beneath the surface. Leora took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would either save her sister or doom them both. "On the grounds that this union is being contracted under false pretenses. The bride has been drugged into compliance, which violates the sacred law of willing consent. I demand a formal investigation before these proceedings continue." The accusation hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. To accuse the Alpha King of violating sacred law was tantamount to treason, punishable by death or exile. But Leora stood her ground, her chin raised in defiance, even as she felt the weight of hundreds of hostile stares. Alpha King Rurik studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he laughed, a sound so cold and devoid of humor that several pack members actually stepped backward. "You dare to accuse me of impropriety?" he asked, descending from the altar with predatory grace. You, who have never shown proper respect for authority, who have been a thorn in your family's side since childhood." Each step brought him closer to Leora, and she could feel the raw power radiating from him like heat from a forge. This close, she could see the intricate pattern of scars that crossed his throat, marks from the ritual combat that had won him the crown. "I dare to speak the truth," she replied, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Something that seems to be in short supply around here." "The truth?" His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the grove. "The truth is that your sister came to me willingly, begging for the honor of becoming my mate. The truth is that your family has orchestrated this entire arrangement in hopes of gaining political favor. And the truth is that you, Leora Ashen, are a bitter, unmarked female who cannot bear to see others achieve what she never could." The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated to cause maximum damage. Leora felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she refused to back down. "The truth," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is that my sister is 19 years old and terrified out of her mind. The truth is that she's been drugged to ensure her compliance, because even you know she would never consent to this willingly. And the truth is that you are nothing more than a predator who preys on young females because you cannot inspire genuine loyalty or affection." The grove fell into absolute silence. Even the night insects seemed to cease their chirping as the full weight of Leora's accusation settled over the assembled pack. She had not merely questioned the Alpha King's judgment. She had called him a predator and a coward to his face, in front of his entire pack. Alpha King Rurik's expression did not change, but the temperature in the grove seemed to drop several degrees. When he spoke, his voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. "Do you know what the penalty is for such insolence?" "Death or exile," Leora replied without hesitation. "And I accept either, rather than watch my sister be sacrificed on the altar of our family's ambition." For a heartbeat, she thought he might actually strike her down where she stood. His hand had moved to the ceremonial blade at his waist, and the muscles in his jaw were tight with barely contained rage. But then, in a move that shocked everyone present, including Leora herself, he stepped back. "You want the truth?" he asked, his voice carrying clearly across the grove. "Then you shall have it." He turned toward the ceremonial table, where a silver chalice sat filled with the traditional mating wine. With deliberate movements, he picked up the cup and held it aloft for all to see. "This wine has been blessed by the pack shamans and prepared according to ancient tradition," he announced. "It contains nothing but fermented grape juice, honey, and the sacred herbs that have been used in mating ceremonies for over 1,000 years. He brought the chalice to his lips and drank deeply, proving that whatever substances might be affecting Kira were not contained in the ceremonial wine. But Leora was not fooled. "The wine may be pure," she called out, "but what of the tea she was given to calm her nerves? What of the special meal prepared to honor the bride? There are a dozen ways to drug someone without touching the ceremonial elements." Alpha King Rurik's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Leora thought she saw something that might have been respect flicker in their golden depths, but it was gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "You speak with great confidence for someone with no proof," he said, setting the chalice back on the table. "Perhaps you would care to test your theory." Before Leora could ask what he meant, 2 guards had seized her arms and dragged her forward. Alpha King Rurik gestured to the pack's chief healer, an elderly woman named Mora, who served as both physician and shaman. "Test the bride for foreign substances," he commanded. "Let the truth be known to all." Mora approached Kira with obvious reluctance, her weathered hands trembling as she began the ritual examination. She checked Kira's pulse, looked into her eyes, and finally pressed her fingers to specific pressure points along Kira's neck and wrists, ancient techniques for detecting the presence of drugs in the bloodstream. The silence was deafening as everyone waited for the verdict. Leora found herself holding her breath, praying that she had been right, that the evidence would vindicate her accusations and save her sister from this nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, Mora stepped back and turned to face the Alpha King. Her voice shook as she delivered her findings. "Your Majesty," she said, her words careful and measured, "I find no evidence of foreign substances in the bride's system. Her symptoms appear consistent with natural nervousness and the stress of the ceremonial preparations." The words hit Leora like a physical blow. She stared at Mora in disbelief, seeing the lie written plainly on the old woman's face. The healer's eyes wouldn't meet hers, and her hands continued to shake, not with age, but with fear. "No," Leora whispered, then louder. "No, you're lying. Look at her eyes. Look at how she can barely stand." But even as she spoke, Kira seemed to be recovering slightly, standing straighter and speaking more clearly. Had Leora been wrong? Had she imagined the signs of drugging? Or had whatever substance been used been designed to wear off quickly, leaving no trace for the healer to find? Alpha King Rurik turned back to her with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "It would seem your accusations are without merit, Leora Ashen. The bride is willing, the ceremony is lawful, and you have publicly dishonored both your family and your pack with baseless allegations." Leora felt the world tilting around her as the full weight of her situation crashed down. She had gambled everything on being right, and now it appeared she had lost. The guards' grips on her arms tightened as they prepared to drag her away to whatever punishment awaited those who defied the Alpha King. But as she looked at her sister one last time, Kira's eyes met hers across the distance. For just a moment, the fog of confusion cleared from Kira's gaze, and Leora saw her mouth a single silent word. "Please." That was all she needed. "You want proof?" Leora snarled, wrenching free from the guards with strength born of desperation. "Then here's your proof." And before anyone could stop her, she strode across the ceremonial space and struck Alpha King Rurik Blackmore across the face with all the force she could muster. The sound of the slap echoed through the grove like thunder. The sound of the slap seemed to reverberate through the sacred grove long after Leora's hand had connected with the Alpha King's face. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the world stood frozen. Hundreds of pack members held their breath. Guards reached for weapons that suddenly felt inadequate, and even the ancient oaks seemed to lean inward to witness what would happen next. Alpha King Rurik Blackmore stood motionless, his head turned slightly from the force of the blow, a red handprint blooming across his left cheek like a brand. When he slowly turned back to face Leora, his golden eyes held something she had never seen before. Not rage, though that was certainly present, but a kind of terrible fascination, as if she had just revealed something he hadn't known he was looking for. "Seize her," he said quietly, and the simple command unleashed chaos. Guards swarmed toward Leora from every direction, but she was already moving, her warrior training kicking in as she dodged the first wave of hands reaching for her. She managed 3 steps toward her sister before a massive guard tackled her to the ground, driving the air from her lungs as her face hit the earth. "Don't hurt her!" Kira's voice cut through the melee, clearer and stronger than it had been all evening. "Please, don't hurt her." The desperation in her sister's plea confirmed what Leora had suspected all along. Whatever drugs had been used were indeed wearing off, and Kira was beginning to understand the full horror of her situation. But it was too late. Iron shackles snapped around Leora's wrists, the cold metal burning against her skin with the particular agony that suppressed a shifter's ability to transform. "Rise," Alpha King Rurik commanded, and the guards hauled Leora to her feet with brutal efficiency. She stood before him now, dirt staining her ceremonial dress, blood trickling from a cut on her lip, but her eyes still blazing with unrepentant defiance. The handprint on his face had darkened to a deep crimson, a mark of dishonor that would be visible for days. "In 7 centuries of rule," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the grove, "no one has ever dared to lay a hand on an Alpha King during a sacred ceremony. The penalty for such an act is death by dismemberment, carried out at dawn before the entire pack." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd, but Leora kept her chin raised. "If that's the price for speaking truth to power, then I'll pay it gladly. Will you?" He stepped closer, so close that she could see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes, could smell the dangerous combination of pine, leather, and something purely predatory that marked him as the apex predator he was. "And what of your sister? What becomes of her when you are dead and gone? Who will speak for her then?" The question hit its mark. Leora's defiance faltered for the first time, as she looked past him to where Kira stood, tears streaming down her face as the last of the drugs cleared from her system. Her little sister, who had always been too gentle for their harsh world, who collected injured birds and wept over wilted flowers, who would be utterly defenseless against whatever darkness lay behind those golden eyes. "I offer you a choice," Alpha King Rurik continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every ear present. "Accept your punishment and die with honor. knowing that your sister will still become my mate and bear my children. Or, he paused, letting the word hang in the air like a blade, accept exile to the blighted lands, and spend what remains of your life knowing that your sacrifice saved no one. The blighted lands. Even the name sent ice through Leora's veins. It was a vast wasteland beyond the pack's borders where the earth itself was poisoned, where no plants grew and no animals lived. It was a place of slow death and madness, where exiles wandered until starvation or the toxic air claimed them. Most lasted less than a month. Some choice, she said, though her voice lacked its earlier fire. More than you deserve. He turned away from her then, dismissing her as if she were already dead. But first, you will witness the completion of the ceremony you so rudely interrupted. You will watch your sister pledge herself to me willingly, and you will know that all your defiance accomplished nothing. Leora wanted to scream, to rage against the casual cruelty of his words, but the shackles drained her strength, leaving her barely able to stand. She could only watch in helpless fury as Kira was led back to the altar, her sister's face pale, but determined now that the fog of drugged compliance had lifted. Do you, Kira Ashen, willingly accept the bond of mating with Alpha King Rurik Blackmore? The officiant's voice shook slightly as he spoke the ritual words. Kira's eyes found Leora's across the distance, and for a moment, something passed between them. An understanding, born of 24 years of sisterhood, of shared secrets and whispered fears. Kira straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin in an unconscious echo of Leora's own defiant gesture. I do, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the grove without a tremor. But then she continued, her words falling like stones into still water. I accept this mating to protect my family and my pack, as is my duty, but I want everyone present to know that my sister spoke the truth tonight. I was drugged to ensure my compliance, and I stand here now, not out of love or desire, but out of necessity. The grove erupted in shocked whispers. Even speaking such words during a mating ceremony was unheard of, a violation of tradition that bordered on blasphemy. But Kira wasn't finished. I also want it known that Leora Ashen acted out of love for me, not malice toward our Alpha King. She saw my distress and risked everything to try to save me. If that is a crime worthy of death or exile, then our pack has truly lost its way. The silence that followed was deafening. Alpha King Rurik stood frozen at the altar, his face unreadable as he processed his new bride's unexpected defiance. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. You would begin our union by publicly humiliating me? I begin our union with honesty, Kira replied, though Leora could see the terror in her eyes. You will have my body and my obedience, but you will not have lies and pretense. I will not start this marriage by betraying the sister who tried to save me. For a long moment, the Alpha King stared at his bride, and Leora saw something shift in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or even a grudging respect. Then his attention returned to Leora, and she shivered at the intensity of his gaze. It seems your sister has inherited your talent for inconvenient truths, he said. Very well. Since she has chosen honesty, let me respond in kind. He turned to address the entire assembly, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority. Yes, the bride was given a mild sedative to calm her nerves. This is not uncommon in arranged matings, and it was done at her mother's request, not mine. The dosage was carefully measured to reduce anxiety without impairing judgment or consent. Lady Mira's sharp intake of breath was audible even from where Leora stood. To have such a thing admitted publicly was a social disaster that would follow their family for generations. However, the Alpha King continued, the accusation that I prey upon unwilling females is both false and insulting. My previous mates died through misfortune and illness, not through any action of mine, and I have never taken a mate who did not come to me willingly, whatever preparations may have been made to ease their transition. He paused, his gaze finding Leora again. But the greater truth here is that Leora Ashen acted exactly as an elder sister should. She saw her sibling in distress and moved to protect her, regardless of the cost to herself. That is the mark of true honor, even if her methods were unorthodox. Murmurs rippled through the crowd at this unexpected development. No one had expected the Alpha King to show any mercy toward the woman who had humiliated him so publicly. Therefore, he said, his voice rising, I hereby modify the sentence. Leora Ashen will face exile, but not to the blighted lands. She will be granted territory on the northern border, harsh land but not poisoned. She will have 1 month to establish herself, after which she will be considered permanently banished from Shadowmere Packlands. It was still exile, still a death sentence for most, but at least it offered the possibility of survival. Leora felt tears prick her eyes, not for herself, but for the unexpected mercy he had shown. But understand this, Alpha King Rurik continued, his golden eyes boring into hers. You will never again set foot in Pack territory. You will never see your sister again. And if you ever attempt to return or interfere in Pack affairs, I will hunt you down myself and ensure your death is neither quick nor merciful. The finality of his words hit Leora like a physical blow. She had saved her sister from one fate, only to condemn herself to another. But as she looked at Kira's tear-stained face, she knew she would make the same choice again. I understand, she said quietly. Good. He turned back to the officiant. Complete the ceremony. The rest passed in a blur of ritual words and ceremonial movements. Leora watched through tears as Kira accepted the Alpha King's mark, the ritual bite that would bind them for life. When it was done, when her sister was officially mated to the most powerful and dangerous man in their world, Leora was dragged away to spend her final night in the Pack's holding cells. The stone cell was small and damp, with a single window that looked out toward the mountains where she would soon be making her final journey. Leora sat on the narrow bench that served as a bed and tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. She had saved Kira from immediate harm, but what would happen in the long term? Would the Alpha King honor the gentleness Kira had shown tonight, or would he eventually grow tired of a mate who had publicly challenged him? Second thoughts? The voice came from the shadows beyond her cell, and Leora looked up to see Alpha King Rurik standing just outside the iron bars. He had changed from his ceremonial robes into simple dark clothing, but his presence still filled the space with barely contained power. About which part? She asked, rising to face him. Slapping you or calling you a predator? Both. He stepped closer to the bars, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. It's been a long night. Not as long as tomorrow will be for me. No, he agreed quietly. It won't be. They stood in silence for a moment, studying each other across the barrier of iron and law. Finally, he spoke again. Your sister will be well treated. I give you my word on that. Your word? Leora laughed bitterly. Forgive me if I don't find that particularly reassuring. You should. His voice hardened slightly. Whatever else you may think of me, I have never broken an oath once given. Kira will be protected and honored as befits my mate. And when you grow tired of her, when her honesty becomes inconvenient, what happens then? That will not happen. How can you be so certain? He was quiet for so long that Leora thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were soft, almost contemplative. Because tonight, for the first time in years, someone told me the truth without fear or agenda. Your sister's honesty was refreshing. Yours... He paused. Yours was extraordinary. The admission hung between them like a challenge. Leora stared at him, trying to understand what game he was playing now. I don't understand. Most people tell me what they think I want to hear. You told me what I needed to hear, even knowing it would cost you everything. He gripped the bars with both hands, his knuckles white with tension. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Rare enough to get me exiled, apparently, and rare enough to keep you alive when anyone else would have died. His golden eyes met hers through the bars. I could have had you executed tonight. No one would have questioned it. But something about you, something made me hesitate. Leora felt her heart skip a beat at the intensity of his gaze. There was something there, something dangerous and compelling, that she didn't want to examine too closely. Don't mistake mercy for weakness, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. I still think you're a predator and a tyrant. Good. The corners of his mouth turned up in what might have been a smile. I would hate to think exile had made you soft. With that, he turned and disappeared back into the shadows, leaving Leora alone with her thoughts and the growing suspicion that her story with the Alpha King was far from over. 3 months in the northern wilderness had changed Leora in ways she hadn't expected. The harsh terrain beyond Shadowmere's borders had stripped away the soft edges of pack life, leaving behind someone harder, leaner, and infinitely more dangerous than the woman who had slapped an Alpha King in defense of her sister. She stood now on the ridge overlooking her makeshift camp, watching the sun set behind the jagged peaks that formed the backbone of the continent. Her cabin, if the rough structure of logs and salvaged materials could be called such, nestled in a valley protected from the worst winds, near a stream that ran clear and cold from the mountain springs. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hers, built with her own hands, and defended with her own strength. The exile had been meant to break her. She understood that now. The Northern Territory was harsh enough to kill the unprepared, isolated enough to drive the social animals that were shifters slowly mad with loneliness. But Leora had discovered something unexpected in her solitude. She liked the quiet. She liked waking to no one's schedule but her own, liked the simple honesty of surviving each day through skill and determination, rather than politics and manipulation. She had also discovered that she wasn't as alone as she'd been led to believe. "You're brooding again," came a familiar voice from behind her. Leora didn't turn around, though a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "I'm contemplating the philosophical implications of my exile. Thank you very much." Davin Greystone emerged from the trees, with the silent grace that marked him as one of the most skilled scouts in the Northern Territories. He was a rogue wolf, cast out from his own pack years ago for reasons he'd never fully explained. Tall and rangy, with silver-streaked brown hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to see everything, he had appeared at her camp 6 weeks into her exile with a deer slung over his shoulder and a proposition. "Thought you might be hungry," he'd said simply, as if offering aid to an exile wasn't grounds for his own banishment if discovered. Since then, he'd become a regular visitor, bringing news from the outside world, trading supplies, and gradually becoming something like a friend. He was one of several rogues who lived in the borderlands, she'd learned. Wolves who had been cast out or chosen to leave their packs, but weren't quite ready to abandon shifter society entirely. "Philosophical implications like how you're going to survive winter with half a roof?" he asked now, settling beside her on the ridge. "Because I have to tell you, contemplation doesn't generate much heat." "The roof is fine," Leora protested, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. "I just need a few more logs to completely rebuild the entire structure," Davin interrupted, "which is why I brought help." As if summoned by his words, 3 more figures emerged from the tree line below. Leora recognized them all, fellow exiles and rogues who had, for various reasons, found themselves living on the margins of shifter society. There was Vera, a fierce woman in her 30s, who had been banished for refusing an unwanted mating. Marcus, a young man whose only crime had been being born with a wolf too weak to satisfy his alpha father's expectations. And Elena, an older woman whose healing gifts had been deemed too dangerous by a pack that feared anything they couldn't control. "A work party?" Leora asked, raising an eyebrow. "A family," Davin corrected gently. "Something you seem to have forgotten exists outside the bounds of traditional pack structure." The word hit harder than she expected. Family. She'd had one once, before politics and power had torn it apart. The thought of Kira sent the familiar pang of loss through her chest. 3 months without a word, without knowing if her sister was safe or happy or even alive. "Any news?" she asked, the question that came inevitably whenever Davin appeared. His expression grew serious. "Some. Your sister is well by all accounts. The Alpha King has been protective of her, more so than anyone expected." Relief flooded through Leora, followed immediately by suspicion. Protective how? He's refused 3 separate attempts by pack elders to arrange secondary matings for him. Apparently made it clear that he considers his union with Kira sufficient. Davin paused, studying her reaction. "There's more." Leora's stomach clenched. "What?" "She's pregnant." The words hit like a physical blow. Leora gripped the rocky ledge beneath her as a mixture of joy and terror swept through her. Joy that Kira was alive and apparently thriving enough to carry a child. Terror at what that child would mean. An heir to bind her sister even more tightly to the Alpha King. A new vulnerability for him to exploit. "How far along?" she managed. 2 months, maybe a little more. Davin's voice was carefully neutral. "The timing suggests conception happened quickly after the mating." Of course it had. The Alpha King would have wanted to secure his bloodline as soon as possible, especially with a mate who had already shown signs of independence. A pregnant mate was a compliant mate, tied to the pack by bonds deeper than ceremony or law. "There's something else," Davin continued, his voice dropping. "Something strange." Leora looked at him sharply. "What kind of strange?" "The Alpha King has been different since your exile. Moody, restless. He's increased patrols along the northern border, supposedly to watch for incursions from enemy packs. But the scouts report that he sometimes leads those patrols himself, which is unusual for someone of his rank. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air ran down Leora's spine. You think he's looking for me? I think he's looking for something, Davin replied carefully. Whether that's you specifically or just answers to questions he hasn't asked yet, I couldn't say. Before Leora could respond, a howl echoed across the valley below, not the wild call of a natural wolf, but the structured communication of a shifter pack. It was answered by another, then another, forming a pattern that made Leora's blood run cold. Border patrol, she breathed, already moving toward the path that led down to her camp. They're close. Too close, Davin agreed, following her with the silent efficiency of long practice. We need to move. Now. They reached the cabin just as Vera, Marcus, and Elena arrived from the other direction, their expressions grim with understanding. This wasn't a routine patrol. It was a hunt. How much time do we have? Leora asked, already throwing essential supplies into a pack. Not enough, Elena replied, her healer's senses more acute than the others. I can smell them. At least a dozen shifters moving fast. Leora's mind raced through possibilities. They could run deeper into the mountains, but winter was coming and the high passes would soon be impassable. They could split up, but that would leave the weaker members of their makeshift pack vulnerable. Or, no. Davin's voice was sharp with understanding. Whatever you're thinking, no. You don't even know what I'm thinking. You're thinking of surrendering yourself to protect the rest of us. And I'm telling you, that's not happening. But Leora was already moving, stepping outside the cabin to face the approaching patrol. She could see them now, dark shapes moving through the trees with predatory purpose. At their head rode a figure she recognized even at a distance, Alpha King Rurik himself, mounted on a massive black destrier, his presence commanding even from hundreds of yards away. Stay inside, she called to the others. This doesn't have to involve anyone but me. Like hell, Vera snarled, emerging from the cabin with a hunting bow in her hands. We don't abandon pack. You're not my pack, Leora protested, even as warmth flooded through her at the declaration. We chose to be, Marcus said simply, taking position beside Vera with his own weapon drawn. Choice matters more than blood. The patrol reached the edge of the clearing and spread out in a classic hunting formation, surrounding the cabin with military precision. But they held their positions, waiting, as Alpha King Rurik dismounted and approached alone. 3 months had changed him too, Leora realized. He seemed leaner, harder edged, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. His golden gaze swept over the assembled rogues before settling on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Leora Ashen, he said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. You've been busy. Not busy enough, apparently, if you found me this easily. She stepped forward, placing herself between him and her companions. What do you want? To talk. The simple answer caught her off guard. She had expected threats, demands, perhaps even immediate arrest for violating some obscure law about associating with other exiles. But talk. About what? About why you're building a pack in my territory. About why my best scouts report organized resistance to border incursions for the first time in decades. About why the rogues and exiles who have plagued the northern reaches for years have suddenly become a cohesive force under your leadership. Leora blinked in surprise. I'm not leading anything. We're just trying to survive. Are you? He took another step closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Because from where I stand, it looks like you're building something. Something that could become a threat, if left unchecked. A threat to what? A handful of exiles trying to keep each other alive through winter? A threat to the established order. A demonstration that pack law and alpha authority aren't the only ways to organize shifter society. His voice dropped, becoming almost conversational. Do you have any idea how dangerous that makes you? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Leora was only beginning to understand. She looked around the clearing, taking in the faces of the wolves who had chosen to stand with her, outcasts all, but stronger together than any of them had been alone. Was that really so threatening? If survival is dangerous, then yes, I suppose we're very dangerous indeed, she said finally. Alpha King Rurik studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, To everyone's surprise, he smiled. Not the cold, calculating expression she remembered, but something warmer, more genuine. I was hoping you'd say that. Before anyone could react to the unexpected response, the Alpha King raised his hand, and his patrol began withdrawing from the clearing, not retreating, but pulling back to a respectful distance. I'm not here to arrest you, he said, apparently reading the confusion on Leora's face. I'm here to make you an offer. What kind of offer? The kind that could change everything. He paused, his gaze intensifying. Tell me, what do you know about the Council of Alphas? Leora frowned. The governing body that oversees the 13 packs. What about it? It's failing. Has been for years, but recent events have accelerated the process. He began to pace, his movements restless, predatory. 3 packs have fallen to internal strife in the past 2 years. 2 more are on the verge of civil war. And the council itself has become so mired in politics and tradition that it can barely function. I fail to see what that has to do with me. Don't you? He stopped pacing and fixed her with that intense golden stare. You've done something here that no one else has managed in generations. You've created a functional community out of the broken pieces that traditional pack structure discards. You've proven that strength doesn't have to come from submission to absolute authority. Leora felt her heart skip a beat as understanding began to dawn. You're not here to destroy what we've built. You're here to study it. I'm here to learn from it. And to offer you the chance to do something with that knowledge. The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Leora could feel the eyes of her companions on her, could sense their confusion and growing alarm. This wasn't how encounters with Alpha Kings were supposed to go. What exactly are you proposing? She asked carefully. A new model. A pack structure that makes room for wolves like these? He gestured toward Vera, Marcus, and Elena. Instead of casting them out. Leadership that's earned through merit, rather than inherited through bloodline. Government that serves the people rather than demanding they serve it. That sounds suspiciously like revolution. It is revolution. His smile widened, and for the first time since she'd known him, it reached his eyes. The question is whether you're brave enough to be part of it. Leora stared at him, her mind reeling. Everything about this conversation defied logic. Alpha Kings didn't propose revolution. They didn't acknowledge the validity of alternative social structures. They certainly didn't travel hundreds of miles to recruit exiled troublemakers. Why me? She asked finally. You could work with any of the other alphas, build alliances, create change from within the existing structure. Because the other alphas are part of the problem. They're so invested in maintaining their power that they can't see how that power is destroying the very thing they're trying to protect. His voice grew more intense, more passionate than she'd ever heard it. But you see clearly because you have nothing to lose. You act on principle because principle is all you have left. I slapped you in front of your entire pack, Leora reminded him. I called you a predator and a tyrant. Why would you want to work with someone who holds you in such obvious contempt? Because you were right. The admission came quietly, but it hit like thunder. Not about everything, but about enough. I had become so focused on maintaining control that I'd lost sight of what I was controlling for. Your sister reminded me of that. At the mention of Kira, Leora's composure cracked slightly. How is she? Really? Strong. Stronger than I expected when I agreed to mate with her. His expression softened. She asks about you constantly. Wants to know if you're safe, if you're well, if there's any way. Any way what? Any way you might come home. The words hit like a physical blow. Home. Leora hadn't realized how much she missed it until he offered the possibility of return. The pack lands where she'd grown up. The familiar faces and scents. The sister she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Is that part of your offer? She asked, hardly daring to hope. Reinstatement? More than that. Alpha King Rurik stepped closer, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his golden eyes. Full pardoning of your exile. Recognition of your pack structure as legitimate. Territory and resources to expand what you've built here. And in return, help me reform the council. Help me prove that there's a better way. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Help me become the kind of leader you thought I should be when you risked everything to oppose me. Leora felt tears prick her eyes, as the magnitude of what he was offering sank in. Not just survival, but the chance to build something better. Not just return, but the power to create change on a scale she'd never imagined possible. But there was something else in his offer, something he hadn't said directly, but she could hear in the undertones of his voice, see in the way his gaze lingered on her face. "There's more, isn't there?" she said softly. "Something you're not telling me." Alpha King Rurik was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible in the tension of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "3 months ago, when you struck me, something changed. Not just politically, but—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you, about your courage, your integrity, the way you stood up to me when no one else would dare." Leora's heart began to race as understanding dawned. "Rurik, I know how it sounds. I know the impossibility of what I'm suggesting. I'm mated to your sister, bound by laws both human and divine, but I can't deny what I feel, and I won't insult you by pretending it doesn't exist." The confession hung between them like a blade, sharp and dangerous and impossible to ignore. Leora stared at him, seeing not the Alpha King who had exiled her, but a man trapped by his own choices, reaching for something he could never have. "My sister is pregnant with your child," she said quietly. "I know, and I will honor my obligations to her, protect and provide for her as I swore to do, but that doesn't change what I feel for you, even if it could never be anything more than feeling." Even then, his voice was firm, resolute. "Some things matter more than what we can have. Sometimes the wanting itself is enough." Leora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. She could refuse his offer, stay in exile with her makeshift pack, build their small community into something sustainable and peaceful. It would be a good life, honest and free from the complications of power and politics. Or she could accept, return to the world she'd been banished from, work to create change on a scale that might actually matter. She could see her sister again, hold Kira's child, be part of something larger than survival, but she would also have to live with the knowledge of what could never be, work alongside a man whose presence would be a constant reminder of roads not taken and choices not made. "If I agree," she said finally, opening her eyes to meet his gaze, "there would have to be rules, boundaries. Whatever you need. Your first loyalty must always be to Kira and your child. Whatever we build together politically, personally you belong to them." Pain flashed across his features, but he nodded. "Understood. And this, whatever this is between us, it stays unspoken. We work together, we fight for the same goals, but we don't cross lines that can't be uncrossed." "Agreed." His voice was barely audible. Leora turned to look at her companions, seeing understanding and support in their faces. They would follow her wherever she chose to lead, she realized. They trusted her judgment, even when it took them into danger. "What about them?" she asked. "My pack. Any deal includes them. Of course, they'll be granted full status as founding members of your new territory. Their exile will be ended, their rights restored. And our independence? We maintain our own structure, our own decision-making processes, within the larger framework of cooperation." "Yes." Leora took a deep breath, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. She was about to make a choice that would affect not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who had chosen to follow her, and potentially the future of all shifter society. "Then yes," she said finally, "I accept your offer." The smile that spread across Alpha King Rurik's face was like sunrise after the longest night. For just a moment, the careful control he maintained slipped, revealing the man beneath the crown, hopeful, relieved, and perhaps a little frightened by the magnitude of what they were attempting. "There's one more thing," he said, his voice carefully neutral again. "The council meets in 2 weeks to address the crisis in the Eastern Territories. I want you there, not as an observer, but as a full participant. Your voice, your perspective, your solutions. You want me to address the Council of Alphas?" Leora's voice rose in disbelief. "The same body that approved my exile? The same body that desperately needs to hear what you have to say?" His expression grew serious. "Change is coming whether we guide it or not. The question is whether we'll be part of shaping that change or simply casualties of it." As if summoned by his words, a commotion arose from the direction of his patrol. Riders were approaching fast, their horses lathered with sweat and urgency. Alpha King Rurik turned toward them, his body tensing with alert readiness. "My lord," the lead rider called as he dismounted. "Urgent message from the capital." He handed over a sealed document with hands that shook slightly. Alpha King Rurik broke the seal and read quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. "What is it?" Leora asked, stepping closer despite herself. "The Eastern Territories have fallen into open warfare. 3 packs are fighting over the same land, and refugees are streaming into neighboring territories." He looked up from the message, his golden eyes grim. "The council has moved their meeting up. We have 3 days. 3 days to travel to the capital. 3 days to prepare arguments that could reshape their entire society. 3 days to transform from exile to revolutionary. Can it be done?" Leora asked. "It has to be." Alpha King Rurik mounted his destrier with fluid grace, then looked down at her, with an expression that mixed determination with something deeper, more personal. "Pack what you need. I'll send an escort for you and your people tomorrow at dawn. And my sister will be there waiting for you." His voice softened. "She's been hoping for this day since the moment you left." As the patrol departed, Leora stood in her clearing watching the dust settle and feeling the weight of destiny on her shoulders. 3 months ago, she had been exiled for defending her sister. Now she was being recalled to help reshape their entire world. "Well," Davin said from behind her, "this is going to be interesting." Leora turned to face her chosen family, the rogues and exiles who had become something more than the sum of their broken parts. They looked back at her with trust, determination, and perhaps a little fear of what lay ahead. "Are you ready for this?" she asked them. "Are you?" Vera countered. Leora thought about the Alpha King's offer, about the impossible feelings that lay beneath it, about the chance to see her sister again, and help build something better from the ashes of what had failed. She thought about the Council of Alphas and the wars brewing in the East, and the weight of change pressing down on all their shoulders. "No," she said honestly, "but I don't think anyone could be ready for what's coming." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and promise, Leora began to pack for a journey that would take her home to face a future none of them could predict. The woman who had slapped an Alpha King was about to become something else entirely, a voice for the voiceless, a bridge between worlds, and perhaps, if she was very lucky, a catalyst for the revolution that her world desperately needed. The moon was rising red again, just as it had on the night that changed everything. But this time, Leora walked toward it with hope instead of despair, ready to face whatever destiny awaited at the end of the road. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.